Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give it a moment here while people trickle in. I'm really excited for the turnout that we have this afternoon. This is great to see all these people showing up today. So I think we can get started here. My name is Greg Stewart, and I'm the coordinator of adult public programs and a museum educator here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I really, as we start many of these programs, I just want to begin by saying that it's with gratitude and humility that the Philadelphia Museum of Art recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hokenk, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the Walking Purchase of 1737, displaced many of the Lenape from this land. The museum and our staff strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonialism and act as allies to Lenape people and their vibrant communities, including the federally recognized nations today, the Delaware Tribe, the Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And we pay honor and respect to Lenape ancestors past and present by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So I'm really excited to welcome you today to our talk, which is really an opportunity. It gives us the opportunity to focus on one element of our collection. We don't always do this. Sometimes we're focused on special exhibitions, but this is really nice to do kind of a deep dive into our permanent collection today, and really focus on one work in particular, Prose of the Trans-Siberian and of Little Jehanne of France, which is a really beautiful collaboration between an artist, a poet, and a printer. But of course, being an art museum, we really want to highlight the role of the artist, in this case, Sonia Delaunay-Terk, in this partnership. It also gives us a chance to consider the role that the Eiffel Tower played in the 19th and early 20th century society, or in some cases, I think, as we'll see, as it maybe didn't have as much as a role as you might think. And we really have the ideal person to do that today in Hollis Clayson, who is a historian of modern art who specializes in 19th century Europe and transatlantic exchanges between France and the US. She is Professor Emerita of Art History and Bergens Evans Professor Emerita in the Humanities at Northwestern University. She's the author of Painted Love, Prostitution in French Art of the Impressionist Era, and her new book, Illuminated Paris, Essays on Art and Lighting in the Belle Epoque. In 2013, she curated the exhibition Electric Paris at the Clark Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Her current project is the inescapability of the Eiffel Tower. I want to welcome you, Hollis. And I think you're muted, just so you know.
Thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone.
So nice to have you. And my colleague Linnea is just going to put a link to your faculty page in the chat for everybody. And I also wanted to introduce Laurel Garber, who is the Park Family Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and who will be our moderator. I think she's also someone, oh yes, hello. You could say hello now, it's fine. Oh, I think you muted.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here.
But as I was saying, she's also ideal for this role for many reasons, but I think especially I'm really excited to say Hollis Clayson was most recently her advisor in her PhD program, and I'm very happy to report that Laurel successfully defended her dissertation. So huge congrats, Laurel, and welcome.
Thank you.
And so just before we begin, just to go over the kind of housekeeping, how this is going to work today. The format is really going to be a presentation from Hollis followed by questions from Laurel and then audience Q&A at the end. We expect this program to last about an hour. If you haven't noticed, you're in Zoom webinar, which means that your cameras and your microphones are turned off, but you can ask questions in the Q&A box as they come up. And Laurel's going to also moderate those questions today. And questions you really like can be upvoted so they rise to the top. Closed captioning is also available by clicking on the CC button in the Zoom toolbar. And this program is being recorded, and we'll send a recording to everyone who is registered so you can watch it all again, just because I know you're going to love it that much. So before I turn it over, I also just want to give a huge thank you to our graduate guides who are sponsoring today's program. The graduate guides are an amazing and dedicated group of emeritus volunteer educators who just do so much for this institution. We're so grateful to them. So without further ado, I think I can turn it over to our speaker today.
Thanks very much, Greg. Here we go. Let's see, it's afternoon in Philadelphia, isn't it? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Here's my now superfluous title slide, just laying out pretty much the elements of what Greg has already made evident to you. Just add, there's an extra little little identification of me there. Lucky me, I'm in Southern California at the moment. Here we go. So I'm starting, of course, with a detail. It's the very bottom, lowest section of the object in the spotlight today. The prose of the Trans-Siberian and of Little Jehanne of France. And it's here now at this moment, just as a glimpse. I'm going to return to this extraordinary object in due course, but I'm going to go forward with other things at this time. I just wonder if I can change. Okay. I have a strong belief that a lot of you who are with us this afternoon may have previously visited Paris. And isn't this, if that's the case, or even if you haven't visited Paris, that's another thing about how this is all recognizable no matter where you are. Anyway, here, here's an evening, an evening scene on the contemporary sidewalk in central Paris. And there are, of course, Eiffel Tower souvenirs all over the place all the time. And I thought this was a good way to inaugurate a sequence that allows us to ponder the current status of the Eiffel Tower, because one of the things I'm interested in, both with you today and in this project that I'm working on, is the ups and downs and changing valences of the tower's meaning and functions. But two things are crystal clear right now, aren't they? Number one, the familiarity of this structure and the widely shared admiration for the structure, even shading over into the category of love. Now, a very influential French literary critic wrote these words in 1964. I wish I could change my screen setup so that I could see them too. Okay, that's better. There's virtually no Parisian glance it fails to touch at some time of the day. The tower is also present to the entire world. This encapsulates very clearly, very succinctly, the idiosyncratic nature of the tower's status. It somehow is ubiquitous, unavoidable in the French capital itself, and it's also somehow known to, familiar to what Barthes says as the entire world. I'm shifting now to a witty sarcasm penned by an author very recently. Doesn't everyone remember going up in the Eiffel Tower at least once, whether or not they actually ever did? I'm showing it next to this extraordinary photograph of you straight up inside of the tower. Now, this witty sarcasm proposes, right, that a visit to the tower is so central these days, indeed indispensable to the attainment of a certain variety of what I would call blasé cosmopolitanism, that it's hard to remember whether one's claim to have done so is real or imagined. Lots more could be said about that, but I hope you'll agree this is another sign of the extraordinary familiarity of this monument. Here's something that just came to my attention very recently. It just sort of popped up on the internet. This travel service, Savor Journeys, has published this massive special report, Why Stay at Hotels with an Eiffel Tower View. And it includes, you know, extraordinary reviews of many of them. And it says I mean, this statement is what I consider to be the ne plus ultra of knee-jerk love of and ignorance about the tower. So for some reason, the Eiffel Tower is always a thrill to look at. All that steel, the crisscrossing design, the sheer height of it, it's just a stunner of an icon. So there's this unquestioning belief that everyone wants to be as close to this gigantic thing as possible. And I'm sure a lot of you know this, there's not even 1 square inch of steel in that monument. It's 100% iron. So intoxication plus ignorance. It's a frequent combination when one discusses the Eiffel Tower. Okay. Now this absolutely extraordinary photograph, which is in the collections of the Philadelphia Museum, helps me segue into the main topic here. As I've already said, I'm studying the way in which key components of the tower's meanings and functions were quite different in the past and over the late 19th century and into the 20th century. Now, the thing that arises is the question, why raise these issues today? Because representations of the tower in the fine arts, I guess unsurprisingly, are always embedded in the matrix or conditions of its changing meanings. And this photograph, which I find, I've already said, extraordinary, suggests, it doesn't it? It suggests the way in which the tower appears to almost threaten that bank of Second Empire residential structures hard by the railroad tracks. It suggests the awkwardness, the problematic proximity of its placement, and indeed machinic gigantism, something that we'll talk about a bit more. This is, you know, I have quite a collection of photographs like this that I've taken over the years. This taken from Le Corbusier's apartment studio, where you see that the upper section, the lantern and aerial of the tower, all of a sudden appearing without warning up over the shiny roof of a sports stadium. And it suggests the possibilities for considering the tower's presence in the city all the way up to this day on its 133rd birthday, uncanny and impertinent. And it's very important for us all to understand that my calling it that is not just an artifact of a possible artifact of 2022. Considering the tower to be a troubling and problematic structure was par for the course right from the very start. Just have a quick look at this. When the tower was first doped out, proposed, drawn up, this is the format. This was actually officially shared with the, it was conceived and planned and in the end executed as the signature, the key structure, the thematic center of the World's Fair in Paris in 1889, the centenary of the French Revolution. In French, the Exposition Universelle, the Universal Exposition. Maurice Kirklin was an engineer in Gustave Eiffel's engineering company. And they had caucused about proposing a 300-meter tower. There are many reasons why that was the format that was pursued. This was an entry in a competition, and there were 107 entries. But look at the degree to which, right from the start, it was a kind of unornamented, naked, huge scale iron pylon. As it turned out, this is actually an image of the project drawing that was actually submitted in 1885. And as you can see, this is extremely important to the identity and the fate of the tower, that an architect whose name will be on the screen shortly, Stéphane Sauvestre, who was also part of the Eiffel team, concocted a rather elaborate, array of ornament. And everyone who writes about the tower, both then and shortly, sort of at the moment of its birth and its first in the beginning of its construction, says that the ornament across the first level and the enormous 100% decorative, non-functional, large-scale arch right at the entrance to the tower made it possible for the tower actually to go forward and be constructed. Now, just a quick reminder, or maybe something that you might not, I don't know, that you might not know, is that when the 300-meter tower was erected, it was overnight the highest, the tallest building structure on Earth. And here's a wonderful sort of grade school textbook presentation of the principal high buildings prior to the tower. Important for us to know, and it's something that was at the center of the rather pitched, complicated Franco-American competitions in the realm of culture and technology at the time. The highest building previously was, yes, the Washington Monument on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It stood and still stands at 169 meters. Now, this wonderful hand-colored photograph that's in the special collections of the National Gallery in Washington introduces us to what the principal characteristics, visual characteristics of the tower was when it was completed and ready to go live at the fair. It was, yes, it was painted red. It was made of 7,000, I repeat, 7,000 tons of iron, including, ready, 2,500,000 rivets. And all of that was largely prefabricated at Eiffel's plant across the river northwest of Paris and put together on the site. This print introduces us to the tower's identity at night, and opinions that were formulated about the tower were of course shaped by this extraordinary cluster network of illuminations. A lot of people are surprised to learn that in 1889, this ambitious thrusting structure was lit almost entirely by gaslight. You can see this in Georges Garin's print. There were 10,000 gas flames in gas globes, and they were strung across the second platform, the first platform, and in the arches at the base of the thing. Also, you see the smoke coming out from the platforms in Garin's print. Those are an extremely complicated kind of lights called Bengal lights, and they produced a lot of smoke. And then two networks of electric floodlights, one all the way at the tip top of the lantern, and then these extraordinary beams, these thrusting, inquisitory diagonal beams that were produced by a brand new kind of apparatus called Manguin projectors. I hope you can understand that this system of lights, especially the degree to which those great big diagonal beams worked as great big monstrous technologies of surveillance, made it possible for a lot of critiques of the tower to be based on that. I'm just going to quickly share two of them with you, two of my favorites. These two caricatures, both from exactly that moment, 1889, stress the impertinence of the tower's size, shape, and its illumination. At left, there's there's the man himself, Gustav Eiffel, shown leapfrogging over the lantern of the tower. And at right, you see this imaginary actual penetration of the moon by that spiky sharp tower, right? Both caricatures reckon that the coexistence of the daring iron tower and the key celestial body of the night, the full moon, which we all saw last night, wherever we were, was a highly visible and troubling example of conflict in the age of the Anthropocene. So here finally is what is really the foundation of my remarks to you today, a statement by the historian Frederick Seitz. He observed after the 1887 artists' protest, no quote unquote official painter, nor any members of the young Impressionist school drew inspiration from the Eiffel Tower. Now, quickly, the 1887 artists' protest, as the tower was under construction and the preliminary drawings had been circulated and were already part of the sort of public conversation. In 1887, a group of extremely sort of well-placed elite artists wrote an excoriating denunciation of the tower that was published in the largest circulation daily newspaper. Oddly enough, it was published on Valentine's Day in 1887, saying that it was an insult to French culture. And the very idea that it would tower over Notre Dame and the Arc de Triomphe was insufferable. And it was something that even the Americans would have repudiated. Now, Zeitz says no official painter, he means certain academic painters. I'm not so sure it's right to call the Impressionist school young in 1887, but nevertheless, the point he makes is absolutely important for us, that virtually no ambitious, vanguard, innovative painter based in Paris addressed him herself to the appearance, the meaning of the Eiffel Tower. Now, it's a different story in the world of prints. Here are two of these extraordinary wood engravings by Auguste Lepere, both made right at that moment in 1889. You can see that the work on the right introduces us to that complicated ornament on the first platform of the tower. Maybe I should just say it right now because some of you are wondering, yeah, it's no longer there. It's not on the tower anymore because it was ripped off and thrown away in 1937. More about that in due course. So also another example of a very innovative printmaker's response to the tower. Henri Rivière, he started working on this series as early as '88. It wasn't published till 1902. He also produced a series of photographs of the tower under construction. I just pulled these two out to share with you today in order to show the degree to which a clever observer like Henri Rivière is also exemplifying here. You see the way in which the, the tower and the factory chimney in the lithograph at the left are shown to be peas in a pod, the same vocabulary. And this exemplifies what I like to call pylon vision, which is to say, to see the tower as if it were just the equivalent of a spiky iron factory chimney, rather than this extravagantly ornamented structure. On the right, Riviere's lithograph takes a slightly different stand. Interestingly for us, it shows the Eiffel Tower in its juxtaposition to the farmer, the cart, the donkey, and so forth, as being the enemy, not just contrast to, but the enemy of the organic. All right, now here is, in addition to Sonia Delaunay-Terk's piece that we're coming up on, here's the other great exception to the general rule of avoidance and disinterest. Here is this canvas by one of the leading lights of vanguard paintings, headquartered in Paris in these years, a work by Seurat. A lot of you will know his Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Jatte. Here is this little canvas. You can see, I decided to include this image at right, so you can see how little it is indeed. And one of the things that one can say about this picture is that it shows a very striking alignment of his divided strokes, his characteristic divided strokes, and the iron morsels, the millions of iron morsels that made up the tower. His palette also, that orangey red with a preponderantly blue lavender behind it, his palette is also sort of striking to the transparent red tower up against the sky. Here is, oh yeah, and right, this is also important to show. It makes all the sense in the world to imagine that Seurat was, devising and beginning to construct this little painting when the tower was still under construction. And when you see the considerable transparency of the midsection at this moment in construction, the resonance between the two forms is even more striking. Here, just as a reminder, is one of Seurat's extravagantly ambitious tableaus. This is from just before the time of the tower, which exemplifies his interest in the highly structured, commercialized corners of Parisian life, sort of a piece with his interest in representing the Eiffel Tower. Okay, here's the question. So anybody else elsewhere? Where are other representations of the tower at the moment when the tower was the new structure in town? Well, to the degree that there are ambitious representations in the pictorial arts, they're almost entirely undertaken by foreign artists in Paris. Things change at the early part of the 20th century, but during this time in the 19th century. And this is not a plug for my own book, but in that most recent book I wrote, Illuminated Paris, I discovered that it was visiting artists in Paris who were interested in portraying the artificially illuminated French capital at night. And that sort of continues when one goes searching around for representations, especially of the illuminated Eiffel Tower at night. This is a wonderful small panel by Charles Courtney Curran, an ambitious American painter who was in Paris for 3-4 years. And it's unprecedented. I haven't found another picture like it, the way in which the silhouetted dense crowd sees the glowing effects of the illuminated tower generalized in the background. This work, no one's done very much work on these things. No one doesn't know very much about the work of this Russian in Paris, Bogolyubov. Here is his nocturne featuring the tower. You can see the tower is a very sort of softened, benign structure in his handling that sort of harmonizes with other elements of the cityscape at night, dark structures with small points of yellow light. And you can see that the crescent moon floating in the sky seems to harmonize with the tower. It's a much more benign representation of the tower at night. This wonderful thing by the American Alfred Henry Maurer, Nocturne Paris, there hasn't been any work done on this. And here is another, might say, sort of inscription of the evening tower into a sort of harmonized Paris nightscape. Its marauding, scary diagonal searchlight doesn't seem to be threatening at all, and it seems to twinkle in coordination with other twinkling lights and reflected lights in the city along the river. Another extraordinary picture, little studied by the Austrian in Paris, Theodor von Hürmann. And here, wonderfully, you see that exploding concatenation of red lights on the tower. far away in the distance, sort of illuminating the sky beyond the dark architecture, again, punctuated by a variety of evening lights. Now, here's one that has certainly preoccupied me and detained me for quite a while. Yes, you will have heard of the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch. Munch was, anyway, when he did the painting on the right in 1890, he was a young student in Paris. He lived out along the Seine to the west in Saint Cloud. He often did this when he established an iconography, a theme that he thought was successful. He reiterated it. Here you can see a painted copy on the left from 1893. And there are also plenty of prints of the same scenario. Now, it's, of course, a long story about what this guy is looking at and the significance of the lights flowing in and what he sees out the window. But the question arose when I gave a lecture about this some time ago, what exactly does he see out the window? And I was challenged to believe that maybe he was looking at, yes, indeed, aspects of the illuminated Eiffel Tower out the window. Really, in 1890? So I have been trying to sort out if the tower was lit up after 1889, or did it sit in the dark until, yes, all those gas globes, all that illumination was stripped off the tower and thrown away and replaced with electric lighting for the next World's Fair, Exposition Universelle, in 1900. And this, look at this wonderful thing. It's an intaglio print that I came across of the tower at night in 1892. Look at that totally unilluminated, hulking structure in the background with the twinkling lights of the cityscape and the reflections in the river. So that made me think that maybe it was sitting in the dark all those years. Anyway, so that's another aspect. Here you have a glimpse of the relit tower, the completely rewired tower in the 1900 exposition. Pardon me, with elements of the diagonal electric searchlight maintained up above. Now here, I just want to introduce us briefly to representation of the tower and its surrounding. It strikes a different note. Paul Signac, a colleague of George Seurat, took a different approach. Maybe you could actually say it represents the addressing of a new subject, namely the industrialization of the area across the river from the tower. This is a new subject here, industry beyond the Pont Grenelle, the elegant bridge you see straddling the river there. The way in which Signac focuses in on smoke and smokestacks makes the tower look exceptionally transparent, pale, ethereal, and pastel, so that the tower no longer is as kind of cognate for a factory chimney, quite differently. And you can see in one of Félix Tollier's photos from this time, here's a photo in 1900, you can see there's the famous giant Ferris wheel copying the Chicago wheel that was in Paris in 1900. Anyway, you can see this photograph also copies the proliferation of industry in that part of the city. And then after the turn of the century, Robert Delaunay enters the scene, which is to say Robert Delaunay famously takes the Eiffel Tower and its surroundings as a leitmotif in his art. Now, let me say respectfully that the text that appears on the Philadelphia Museum of Art website says, apropos of the Eiffel Tower that Delaunay chose to paint, it said, when completed, the Eiffel Tower had become a symbol of technological progress and modernity. You know, that might not be right, because in fact, in 1909, the Eiffel Tower was not at the center of very many people's attention. It was considered to be sort of old hat and barely visited anymore. I'm going to quote the art historian Henri Loiret, and he's thinking of the Delaunay pictures. The eventual pictorial glory of the tower coincided with the decline of its fortune, when it was neither an object of controversy nor yet a mythic symbol. So I think it gives the Robert Delaunay pictures sort of a new charge insofar as he focused on it when it was not exactly at the center of French, let's say at the center of French consciousness. And this continued to be, I'm focusing on another one of these wonderful pictures in the Philadelphia Museum collection. In this watercolor, you can see the way in which he reduces the Eiffel Tower to its sort of geometric, the basic geometric unit, and shows it embedded in the other geometric, you might say, units that constitute the rest of the built environment of the city. Now I'm going to show you this picture that's from my hometown, the great Eiffel Tower painting and related drawing from the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's interesting that a lot of art historians who've worked on these gripping representations of the tower and the city by Delaunay talk about the way in which he engineers an interpenetration of the structure of the tower, of the built environment of the city and the surrounding space. But it would also be possible, if you were inclined to think in this way, to think of it as having staged an invasion of the city by the tower. I was thinking, some of these photographs I've collected of the contemporary tower, cheek by jowl with domestic architecture that has a certain kind of invading monster science fiction quality, in many ways adumbrated by some of Robert Delaunay's work. Now, finally, here we are on the pièce de résistance, the actual center of our investigation today. I'm going to say two things, and then we're going to actually see an animation of the book. Just so you know that this was, right from the get-go, a complicated collaboration between the visual artist Sonia Delaunay-Terk. Terk is her birth name, and the poet Blaise Sendroir. And they intentionally avoided, eschewed traditional book binding in favor of a continuous sheet of paper that folded up like an accordion to resemble a travel map more than a book. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and an animation will appear before you. Ready? You don't need a narration from me. You can see this complicated, wonderful thing. Great. Now, so you can see now that what you have on the screen before you now is the very lowest portion. So the poem, you can even see that, all right, with this detail. Let me say that the Sonia Delaunay contribution is a pochoir print, which is to say it's gouache that was pushed through stenciled cutouts to create this multicolored concatenation of forms. And as you saw in the animation, it's preponderantly abstract. Only in this lower left-hand corner do you actually get a legible figuration, which is none other than, yes, that tower that is side by side with, indeed, poking through, this time not the full moon, but the Ferris wheel at the 1900 World's Fair. The poem relates in first person an imaginary journey through Russia and Mongolia on the Trans-Siberian Railway, the then longest rail line in the world, and the temporality, the chronology of the poem is that it is set during the first Russian Revolution and Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Significantly, the work was intended to be printed in an edition of 150. Only 60 were printed in the end. But why 150? This is a rather juicy detail. Each of these things measures 2 meters tall when unfolded. And if they had produced 150 copies and laid them all end to end, the height of all of them were to equal 300 meters, the height of the Eiffel Tower. So the Eiffel Tower was in some ways a kind of, I don't know quite how to put it, a kind of guiding principle. Now, I draw here heavily upon the work of a graduate student, PhD student at Northwestern, Tamar Karastishvili, who's written wonderfully about this work. And I'm quoting her here. She argues that there was, quote, something to think about, quote, a congruence between the foreigner's unique perspective and the rise of novel forms of urban perception that were characterized by shock, end quote. So Tamar wants us to think about this in terms of sort of the double whammy, the collaboration between two foreigners' perspectives. And she argues that it exemplifies, therefore, itinerant modernism. Now, at the very end of Sendrar's poem, he references Paris, city of the unique tower, of the great gibbet, and of the wheel. So yes, it ends up as a sort of tip of the hat toward the indispensability of the tower in Paris, but he does liken the tower to a great execution tower. It's important here, again, to not sort of collapse it into some kind of tribute, Valentine to the tower. We have to understand how ambivalent this complicated artwork was in its engagement with technology, the way in which it plays with fragmented perception. Now, there are many more things to say about that, but I'm going to just show a couple quick things by way of conclusion. Just, FYI, Robert Delaunay, yes, that Sonia and Robert Delaunay were married. Robert Delaunay continued to produce many images of the tower, fragmented, eviscerated. As you see here, here's a lithograph from 1925. This is a very complicated thing. He also produced in 1925, because we should get going. I'm going to just pass over without comment. And I thought it might be fun to land on an image that's one. This is an etching by Marc Chagall, another voluntary exile in Paris from the Russian Empire. Here's his etching of the Eiffel Tower from 1942. It's hard to consider it anything else other than 100% irreverent, fantastical, and utterly goofy. Anyway, so I end with the utterly goofy. Thank you for your attention. Stop share, Laurel. Yep.
Yeah, and we can pull it up again if there are questions that can bring us back to the slides. Thank you so much. This is really wonderful. I have a couple questions, and a couple have come in already from our viewers, and I'm sure more will trickle in, but I'll ask a short one to start that I'm curious about the tower itself, which of course you've told us was built for the 1889 World's Fair. Was it intended to be a permanent structure in the plans to build it or upon its construction? Or I don't know, was there some decision making once built that it should be kept forevermore? Just curious about its sort of permanence or its longevity, and how that might have played into artists responding to it in print or in painting.
Well, I mean, you've asked a question that, of course, would require an extremely long and tedious answer, but the shortest form is it is the extraordinary, I mean, thinking in a global perspective, it is the extraordinary World's Fair structure that survived, that wasn't taken down, because by definition, young people are always surprised by this in our era of more advanced environmental thinking, that World's Fairs were made up of all kinds of complicated things that were destroyed and taken down. The thing with the Eiffel Tower is that it had to do with finances right from the start, that Eiffel had to pony up some money because the city had not allocated enough money to actually construct the tower. And it ended up being a somewhat, whether it was fortuitous or not is another story, but it ended up resulting in a deal whereby the tower was going to stay up for 20 years. It was, therefore, there was a contract that had it going till 1910. And then in 1910, it would be revisited. And there were constant revisitations. And it ended up that many ways in which the tower served science and industry allowed it to stay up. So it's a sort of a historical surprise, but Eiffel was a clever guy and continued to strike deals that let it stay up. And then let's call it, its sort of madly passionate world galvanizing popularity now was an artifact of the post-World War II era, when it was finally made a monument historique, and it's never going to be pulled down now.
I'll ask another question, since you just brought up the sort of global perspective. It's so interesting that your project, End to Mars, consider, the interest in emigre artists or foreign artists in Paris in the Eiffel Tower. And it makes me wonder whether your research has surfaced materials, and I think maybe the answer is not, about the circulation of the tower in former French colonies. I'm just thinking a bit about if the tower in some ways has become synonymous with Paris, what was its place in the colonial imagination of France?
Well, in briefest form, one of the things that I'm working on now is the tower as the supremely self-confident emblem of empire in 1889. And in fact, the architect of the ornament on the tower, Stéphane Sauvestre, was also the supervising architect of the colonial exhibition. And 1889 was the first World's Fair that included a colonial exhibition. And the highlight, it's too complicated to explain, but it was slightly, the Eiffel Tower's on the Champ de Mars, and the colonial exhibition was over on the Esplanade des Invalides, but there was a little train that ran back and forth, so it was connected. And the highlight, the sort of the most impressive structure in the colonial exhibition was the first European replica of Angkor Wat. And the French hadn't completely gotten its claws into Cambodia. It wouldn't become a French colony until 1910, but the French were already, so Angkor Wat, the Angkor Wat replica and the Eiffel Tower were already talked about as being twins. That somehow that Angkor Wat would have some kind of French imperial identity that sort of glued it to the triumph of the Eiffel Tower was already being talked about in 1889. So that's the beginning of an answer. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a couple really good questions that I want to start us with. Actually, I'm going to combine a question of my own with one that's come in, which is, there's a question from Catherine Huston, who says, of all the structures, what made this one the focus of your study and exploration? And I was curious, in sort of thinking about the inescapability of the tower, what does your research actually look like? What kind of archives are you dealing with? How do you kind of, what's the archival trace of that inescapability for you?
Well, so I'm embarrassed in advance by how trivial this is and what actually got me started on this. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of a loose end from that book I wrote on artificial illumination technologies, because I had not really completely, to my satisfaction, sorted out the illumination of the tower. I'm still fascinated by knowing when was it illuminated and when was it turned off and for whom and for what purposes. But also I wrote quite a lot about that Edvard Munch picture that I showed you in passing. And I gave, I gave a lecture. Can you imagine this? Me, I gave a lecture about Munch in Oslo, Norway. And, in Oslo, every single art historian in Norway works on Edvard Munch. And one of the grand poobahs of Munch studies said to me after my lecture, he said, "Do you know what he sees out the window?" He said, "That's the Eiffel Tower." And that sort of got me started, I must say. That got me started. I'm also, I've long been preoccupied by a longstanding American belief that somehow it is Parisian cosmopolitanism that actually provides the certain kind of cultural veneer that Americans are lacking and need. I'm always been interested in understanding the history of that and debunking it, and dealing more with the tower is in that direction. And the archives I'm consulting, it's all kinds of writing about the tower that appeared in 1889 is what I'm sort of looking at now.
Thank you. Okay, lots of questions coming in, so I might ask Greg to help me stay on top of them. I want to just maybe end my portion with a question about the railroad and its relation to the Eiffel Tower, just because that came up in many of the images from our collection that you shared. Is there anything you might say about those two in relation to each other, or what they both symbolized?
I think that's, I don't know, Laurel, it's a wonderful and demanding question. I'm not so sure that I'm the one that can actually do it. I mean that, the railroad was, the railway was the mechanical, the creature of industry that sort of stood for the 19th century. And the degree to which it was seen to be a cousin, or somehow the tower was part of that same vocabulary. I mean, it's just that the tower was seen to be so oversized and useless. It was in some ways the opposite of the railway. But Eiffel Tower, Gustav Eiffel built some of the most important railway bridges in the world. So there's also idiosyncratically, sort of surprisingly, paradoxically, that connection as well.
That actually relates to a question about thinking about the Eiffel Tower and the Brooklyn Bridge, or I guess towers and bridges.
In fact, I've just finished reading at long last this really important book by Billington, the grand old man of architectural history at Princeton, called The Tower and the Bridge, in which he makes a very strong, and I think for me, convincing case that the Eiffel Tower and the Brooklyn Bridge were the great defining breakthrough structures of the end of the 19th century. And in fact, I'm going to see what I can do to put the Brooklyn Bridge back into my consideration of the tower.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Tamar that returns us to the quote you shared from Roland Barthes, and then the sort of notion of touch in that quote and haptics, and how that relates to the tower. And Tamar asks about that, and then the physicality of the Prose, the accordion book by Delaunay-Terk and Sendrars, how we could think about that as a very tactile, portable object, especially with the pochoir factor. So she just wondered if you have any thoughts connecting those dots.
I think that one of the things about, to sort of consider this complicated topic through the lens of the haptic and the touchable, one of the things about the tower, and I'm finding lots and lots of references to this, is that the searchlights, the illuminations of the tower were considered to be the vehicles of contact between people out around it and the tower, that to be illuminated, if only sweepingly, briefly, instantaneously by those lights, was to have been touched by the tower to establish a kind of virtual, right? It's a very sort of 21st century concept, a virtual contact with the tower via these columns of light. Now, And again, you know, it also reminds us of another idiosyncrasy of the tower, this structure that was meant to be inhabited, experienced, visited from the inside, and also to be admired and scrutinized from the outside, that it had an inside outside. So the role played by light was extremely important in sort of maintaining touch with people who were out there who were not yet on the inside. Anyway, the question about portability and touch with the Delaunay-Terk Sendrar's volume tomorrow is better equipped than I am to deal with this, but I've often wondered, it has to do to some degree with the sort of exclusivity. How many people were actually entitled to touch the book and to experience its portability? It has to do with, I mean, in some ways, it has to do, especially now, with, you know, private elite ownership. And I mean, we can see that wonderful animation, but we can't actually lay hands on the thing and haul it around. So it as it were, it spoke to and was devised in order to, you know, sort of invoke imagined touchability, but the actual touchability was a very limited experience, I would say.
Thank you. I will just make a small plug here for any of the PMA guides or local Philadelphia residents. We, of course, have this amazing object in the collection in my department, which is prints, drawings, and photographs. And you can make an appointment anytime to visit our department, and we can show you the object, which we actually keep it framed, so totally unfolded and in the dark, because it's very sensitive to light, which is why we can't have it in our galleries. But you can make a special appointment and view it with us anytime, and I encourage you to do that. Greg, is there any last questions that you feel like we should address? There's a question here, Holly, about the Robert Delaunay painting or paintings that you shared, and what he may have meant by the kind of eviscerating the tower in his work. So when it becomes sort of transparent, I think that was one of the paintings you showed. What could you say more in your reading of what that means?
You know, I'm just at the beginning of trying to think from my own perspective about those Delaunays, and thinking that they might actually, you know, two things that, you know, I bring to the table. Number one, that, you know, the Eiffel Tower was not some starring Parisian metonym, emblem of modernity, global icon in 1910, far from it. So he's actually not sort of trading on the tower's fame and taking it up, and the possibility that he also is devising an iconography of the Eiffel Tower as an impertinent monster, as opposed to just a motif in Orphic cubism. So the possibility of dealing with a structure that was actually falling into almost ill repute, and something that might have been seen as a monstrous presence in the city. Anyway, these are two prospects I'm going to try to explore. I saw something come up in the chat asking me what was my favorite painting of the Eiffel Tower.
So that was going to be the question that I was going to pitch to you too. So maybe that's a good one to end on, actually.
See, that's just too lame for me to say. I don't. Oh yes, my favorite. Let's say, pictorial image of the tower. I must say, the winner for me is, it's not a painting, it's that print by Henri de la Vallée of the tower at night in the dark. That's my favorite right now. So you can see that in my maturity, I'm obviously tilting Gothic.
That is so intriguing, and it looks so much like a mezzotint to me, but it's
an aquatinted soft ground.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for that question. I'm going to be thinking about that some more. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hollis. Thank you, Laurel. Thank you to Linnea West and Steve Keever, who've been helping through the behind the scenes stuff. Thank you to Heidi, our captioner. This has been such a lovely discussion. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes just to make sure I don't miss anything here. And just a huge thank you to the graduate guides, of course, for sponsoring this and for everything that they do. And of course, big thank you to everybody who attended today. It's just by showing up that you're really helping to support the programs that we do. So it means a lot to us. If you were one of the people that happened to donate to this program, we want to thank you for that as well. And also, of course, if you are a member, that is another great way to support us. We can put a link to the chat in the chat if you want to donate more to our annual fund, or if you didn't do that, we'll have that information there. And I will say our next talk is going to be next week on December 14th at noon, titled Between Glorification and Exploitation. We have scholars who are really looking at Black feminism from the perspective of sports and AI in relation to an exhibition by Martine Sims, or a work and an exhibition called Neural Swamp, which is the Future Fields Commission. So that will be next week. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming, and I hope everybody here has a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Greg, very much. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks, Laurel. Thanks a lot.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you.
Great. It's always great to be in Philadelphia.
Come back soon.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna look at the chat before I leave fast.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, Tamar and Jake are here. Okay.
And my dear mom.
Oh, nice.
Oh, really? Nice.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you later.
Okay. Thank you all. Bye-bye.